Today I'm going to talk again, a little differently, about some of the precursors to and attitudes towards persons with disabilities, going back to the Greek and Roman eras, as we've talked before. Due to the belief in the unity of the body and soul, Greeks often had a negative attitude towards persons with disabilities. Like the Greeks, the Romans would legally kill individuals who had, instead of you see the words puny or deformed, basically children with disabilities. And attitudes were also influenced and formed by the social class of the person and by mythology. In the Middle Ages, disability was seen as a punishment, and mental illness was viewed as being possessed by some sort of evil or devil processes. Monks and priests often treated persons with disabilities and mental illness rather than physicians, due to the believed religious nature of disability. In early America, self-sufficiency was important. The 13 colonies often excluded individuals who could not support themselves, kind of like a survival of the fittest, and or that in order to be a member of the colonies, a person had to be self-sufficient or able to be supported or be able to support themselves rather than being dependent on others for assistance or support. Disability was viewed as a punishment. Medical schools, the first medical school in early America was opened in 1765, and medical practices were often based on pseudoscientific opinion, and that often did not benefit the patient. I think there was an attitude sometimes, like in medical practice, that the operation was successful but the patient died. Treatment of mental illness was often based on social economic status and the nature of the illness. Mental health treatment very often consisted of exorcising demons, using straitjackets, and later on doing lobotomies to try to handle some of the symptoms of mental illness that people were exhibiting. And of course that all changed in the middle part of last century with the advent of medications. Rehabilitation in the early 19th century in the U.S. and to the middle of the century, Gallaudet was a pioneer for individuals with hearing impairments. Dorothea Dix worked with individuals with mental illness and helped to promote more humane treatment and mental institutions. And then we had medical advances, one example being Dr. Lister's antiseptic surgery. Why this is important was because it was a recognition, without really knowing, of the role that germs and bacteria and sterilization played in terms of treating individuals and not causing further infections or illness or disability. Okay, I'd like to go now to a discussion of some legislation that was part of the rehabilitation process. And as we talked in a prior presentation, when I gave you some foundations about what led up to rehabilitation and rehabilitation legislation, I'm not going to repeat that. You already have that. But I am going to talk about legislation that was that were the foundations of vocational rehabilitation practice and some of the major foundations of vocational rehabilitation practice. And I'm going to start with the Smith-Hughes Rehabilitation Act. And the Smith-Hughes Rehabilitation Act, or Public Law 236, basically established the state federal vocational rehabilitation program. It was passed at the end of World War I. Oh, let me go to that slide, sorry. There we go. It was passed at the end of World War I, and it was called the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917. And what it did was it set a precedent for federal funding of educational programs of all types and established a pattern and a process for vocational education. Until this time, really, there had not been human service programs that addressed the needs not just of the people with disabilities, but of any individual, of any groups of individuals. And money was provided on a matching basis, which is part of the way the rehabilitation program operates today. The money was provided on a matching basis, and procedures were established whereby federal money was budgeted to states, and states had to match those funds. So this provided the foundation for the way public rehabilitation is funded today. Now, the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918 established a board of vocational education, which was mandated to and authorized to operate a vocational rehabilitation for veterans. And this act became known as the Smith-Sears Veterans Rehabilitation Act. Now, at this time, this was the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act. Civilians were not included. However, many of the legislators who supported this act were also committed to a program of vocational rehabilitation for civilians. So in 1920, the Smith-Vest Vocational Rehabilitation Act was passed. And this act provided a program of vocational rehabilitation for civilians. And within an 18-month period, 34 states had passed legislation that would take matching monies, as we talked before with Smith-Hughes, on a 50-50 basis. And the purpose of this act was to provide vocational guidance, training, what was called occupational adjustment, as well as prosthetic services and job placement services. The emphasis in this act, again, this is where the emphasis first became of providing services to the least severely disabled individuals with the view or the philosophy that they could best benefit, so the monies that were being spent would have the highest probability of having a positive outcome, and it will also serve persons with physical disabilities. And as we've said, persons with mental disabilities were viewed as being basically unable to participate in society. So persons with significant mental impairments were not part of this Rehabilitation Act. In fact, people with mental impairments were not included at all. This was for people with physical disabilities. And the emphasis, again, was on providing services that would assist persons with physical disabilities, civilians with physical disabilities, return and enter the job market. Now, this was the beginnings of the public rehabilitation program. And in 1935, this next piece of legislation, the Social Security Act, provided the first permanent basis for a federal vocational rehabilitation program. Up until this point, the rehabilitation program had been funded on continuing types of legislation, not permanent legislation. And this provided not just Social Security for workers who were of retirement age, but it also provided a program of vocational rehabilitation for persons with disabilities. Let me read to you, you don't have this quote, but let me read to you a 1936 publication from the Federal Rehabilitation Office by a man named John Krantz, K-R-A-T-Z, called Vocational Rehabilitation of the Physically Handicapped. Now, of course, we don't use the word handicapped anymore, but in any event, let me just read to you what he said, and you can see how some of the wording and some of the concepts relate to today. He goes on and he says, of fundamental importance is the principle that from the inception of a rehabilitation case to its conclusion, only one agent should deal with the disabled person. One of the most important services given by a rehabilitation agent, because we didn't have the term counselor at the time, is that of counsel and advisement. It is a continuous service designed to assist the disabled person in choosing, preparing for, entering upon, and making progress in an occupation. That the rehabilitation professional needs to look at the client as a person of worth and dignity. It is a far better procedure to have the person assume a measure of initiative and responsibility for the development of his own rehabilitation plan, obviously referring to the consumer. The rehabilitation agent must be skillful in assisting the applicant to appraise his own abilities, capabilities, and deficiencies. So what we really have here are two things. One, we have a definition of a rehabilitation counselor, or a preliminary definition of a rehabilitation counselor, and we also have kind of the roles of what a rehabilitation counselor would do. So it's kind of interesting that this was published in 1936, middle of the Depression, Great Depression, and many years before we had what was known as rehabilitation counselors. As you'll see, that doesn't occur, the beginnings of that don't occur until 1954. Now there's another piece of legislation, which I don't have here, which was the 1936 Randolph-Shepard Act. And this was very significant insofar as it established the what we know today as the vending stand program, and provided priority for individuals who are visually impaired or blind to operate vending stands in federal buildings or federally sponsored buildings. And of course many states have followed through on that as well. And this established the Randolph-Shepard Act established what could be called a set-aside for vending stands and vending establishments in public buildings, federal buildings, and state buildings by extension in states that pass such legislation to operate such facilities. And of course that entailed training. It also entailed being able to assist persons who are blind to be able to be self-sufficient through the operation of a vending stand. Now, in World War II, and of course, just before I get into World War II, the vending stand program is with us today, and it's been updated and modified, but it is still a program that is presently in place. Now, in World War II, rehabilitation programs were affected in many ways as well. And at the height of World War II, legislation was passed by Congress that provided an expansion of rehabilitation programs. And what we had was Public Law 78-113, which was the Bard-La Follette Act of 1943. And let me read you a statement by a man named C. Esco Oberman at the time. And he says, the tragedy of the war and the new approaches to personnel practices, again flowing from the war as we've talked, required that the need to seek out all workers who could be productive was advanced, and vocational rehabilitation was furthered under the conditions that resulted from this war. Now, what we had here in through the Barton-La Follette Act of 1943 was the development of what was called the Federal Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, and what we had was the mandate of Congress to channel persons with disabilities and money to assist persons with disabilities be trained and rehabilitated to provide to take jobs and provide labor for the war effort, to contribute to the war effort. And significantly, the definition of rehabilitation changed to any services necessary to render a person with a disability fit to engage in a remunerative occupation. And also, very significantly, physical was deleted. And what we had was the development or the inclusion, I should say, not development, but the inclusion of persons with mental impairments, including persons with mental disabilities, as well as mental illness, for the first time being eligible for rehabilitation services. Of course, today we refer to such persons as having intellectual disabilities. We also had a development or we had a refinement of the role of what counseling is as a result of this legislation. And this, what I'm going to read you now, wasn't in the legislation itself. What I'm going to read you came out of a report from the Rehabilitation Office in 1945 regarding counseling. And it says, counseling or advisement is an essential service extended through the rehabilitation process to persons with disabilities. Counseling is the one service extended to people with disabilities directly by state rehabilitation agencies. And counseling becomes or is the core of the rehabilitation process around which all other services revolve. Now, we still don't have a specific role for a rehabilitation counselor. That didn't occur until the 1954 Vocational Rehabilitation Act amendments. And in 1954, what we had was an implementation of the philosophy of the day, and the philosophy of the day was, again, a re-emphasis on serving persons with the least significant disabilities. Well, you also had a significant leader in rehabilitation, a woman by the name of Mary Switzer, who became the head of the rehabilitation program. And she promoted the rehabilitation program, and she was a strong advocate for persons with disabilities. And the legislation that was passed, the 1954 Rehabilitation Act amendments, authorized the development of several things. One thing it authorized was the development of rehabilitation facilities. So many of the physical rehabilitation facilities that we see today were established through funds and monies that were made available through this legislation. And also, the rehabilitation amendments of 1954 also laid the foundation for training programs at the graduate degree level for rehabilitation counselors. And it was from this legislation that flowed the development of rehabilitation programs as we know them today. And rehabilitation programs at the master's degree level were established in it's out of the 1954 amendments to the Rehabilitation Act. And we had during this time period universities expressing an interest in developing master's degree programs as funds to support students to go into training were made available. And we also had during this time faculty members from different institutions, different agencies, different universities getting together to devise what should the curriculum look like in a rehabilitation master's degree program. And many such master's degree programs were developed in counseling programs. Interestingly enough, they grew out of guidance and counseling programs. They didn't grow out of social work programs. So that's kind of an interesting sidelight at that counseling was the foundation for rehabilitation education programs, and it was guidance and counseling programs that were seen as the most likely programs that should be developing master's level programs. We also had expansions of Social Security. We had the inclusion of disability programs for persons with who were disabled under social and who would be eligible for Social Security disability. These are known as SSI and SSDI programs today. SSI programs are for eligible individuals who are unable to work and have limited resources and have not had extensive work histories. And SSDI programs are for persons who have contributed to their Social Security accounts and are no longer able to work. And the basic definition of disability under Social Security, although SSI and SSDI programs are funded separately, are the inability to perform jobs in the competitive labor market and the disability or combination of disabilities that the person has is expected to last more than 1 year or result in death. And many individuals receive SSI and SSDI, and those programs grew out of the Social Security amendments that were passed during the period of 1956 to 1972. What we also had, which I'll talk about in another presentation in more detail, are Medicare and Medicaid programs coming out of this time period. And I'm going to go into those in somewhat more detail, as I said, in a different presentation. The 1960s saw an unprecedented period of growth in vocational rehabilitation. And in part, this was part of the human service programs that were developed, part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, and before Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy's New Frontier, but really implemented as part of what Lyndon Johnson did. And we had Public Law 333, the Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1965. And those amendments increased funding, increased money for rehabilitation facilities, and what we also had during this period, which I said in another presentation led to the rehabilitation program going in a direction that that later on led to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, was the expansion of the terms of the eligibility of who could be who could receive rehabilitation services to individuals who were economically disadvantaged and did not need to have a specific physical or mental disability. And this led to what was known as social disabilities. And rehabilitation during this time period was also seen as kind of going in the direction of becoming a public assistance program. And we had in 1968 further amendments that put the rehabilitation program in that direction. And again, the philosophy kind of was in line at the time with the Great Society programs and Lyndon Johnson's concept of eradicating poverty. And the rehabilitation program was seen as being an instrument to help in the war on poverty, as it was described at that time. We also had during this time period the development of programs that served persons who were viewed as having a social disadvantage. So the concept of social disability was developed. We don't talk about that today. And as a result of this, and one of the changes that did occur was with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, really was, from my perspective, the beginning of pulling back from serving persons with quote social disability and moving in the direction of what we know today, because the rehabilitation program was viewed as a welfare type of program. And again, that was as a result of the direction that the rehabilitation program had gone to. And that leads up to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which I've talked about in a different slide presentation.